Thank you all for making your way back in here, and we're moving now to a little bit of a different format where we're going to have a discussion across the panel here, sort of reflecting on some of the ideas that we've talked about this morning, and then directing us towards the discussions for the afternoon. On the panel, I want to welcome our panelists today, and I'll just come down the line here from left to right as you're seeing us. So. We have Professor Michael Neblo, who's Department of Political Science here at Ohio State, and he's also the director of the Institute for Democratic Accountability and Engagement, IDEA, which I think is a great acronym. And he also studies deliberation and democracy. And then next we have Lieutenant Colonel Michael Young, U.S. Air Force retired, who's been working with the AVF Forum on intergenerational attitudes toward military service and the civil military gap. And then finally we have Professor Rick Herman, who I've already introduced you to before, but who's the former director here at the Mershon Center and the chair of the Political Science Department, who's worked a lot on these kinds of issues. So I wanted to kick off our discussion right now with a very broad question, and then try to get into some more specifics as the discussion goes along. So this would be sort of open to any of you all about the question, sort of open to any of you all to respond. But I'm wondering if you could each say something about what you think about what obligations citizens have in a democracy to contribute to the common defense. What in a democratic society, what should be the relationship between the citizenry and the military, and what are the obligations of the civilians to serve?
Sure, I can start. So first of all, thank you for inviting me to this. Couple of quick caveats. One, I'm not having flop sweat. I walked over here and have not been able to stop sweating since
It's pretty warm in here.
Yeah, and it is a little bit warm in here. But I'm really delighted to be here. I should say I don't really have substantive expertise on civilian-military relations or the questions associated with the AVF forum, but I have been trying to train up lately, and I do have some expertise on how democracies come to make difficult decisions along these lines. And so I really want to praise the organizers of this forum and the students who are participating. I think this is exactly the kind of conversations that we need to have in a healthy democracy. So and one more caveat, I'm going to sort of separate out my personal views, and I'm perfectly happy to discuss my personal views, but I'm going to try to speak in the role of a political theorist, a democratic theorist. I sort of switch hats. I was trained in philosophy and statistics as an undergraduate and did my PhD in political science, so I'm not afraid to talk about normative issues rather directly, but I also do empirical research on how people come to make decisions through discursive processes. So the first thing that I'll just lay out is that there's, I think, three basic models. There's not one question or not one answer to what democratic theory would say about the responsibility or the relationship of the responsibility of citizens to contribute to the common defense. I'd say that there's at least three. There's probably more, but three big ones. And they go with the modifier on democracy, right? So we've got democracy as a term, but oftentimes you'll hear people say liberal democracy. And just to be clear, liberal here does not mean the left wing of the American political system. It has to do with liberalism as it was developed in the 18th and 19th century. As a matter of fact, liberal democracy tends to, as it's used here, tends to sort of tilt a little bit towards what we would call center conservative, moderate conservatives in the United States context. Then there's another model that's sometimes called the Republican model, and again, this has nothing to do with the Republican Party in the United States. And then the third one I would call the deliberative model, or sort of straight democracy. The liberal model, I think, vis-a-vis military-civilian relations, tends to be sort of suspicious of the military, and the liberal model is very concerned about protecting individual rights. It's very concerned about tyranny. It's very concerned about the state interfering in people's lives a lot and really wants to create a very wide scope of freedom and leave people alone. Under that liberal conception, I think there would be a pretty high bar to have conscription during peacetime. Now, the Republican model is more about building community and the notion of there being sort of an organic identity associated with the nation state, and that it's okay for the state to help build citizens, the kinds of citizens it needs to have a healthy republic. And again, as a general matter, I think that the Republican tradition, which goes all the way back to the Roman Republic, would put a lot of emphasis on military service and contributing to the common defense and having skin in the game, to quote a title that I read in preparation for this. And so there would be a relatively low bar. And in addition, they would be very open to some of the secondary goods associated with military service in terms of creating a common national identity, et cetera, et cetera. And then this third model that I'll call the deliberative model says, look, there's no way to decide before the fact. There's no tilt on, and there's no pre-given answer to what the relationship should be. That's exactly what a democracy is supposed to decide. And that what we really should be focusing on is process and procedures of average citizens becoming properly informed on the topic, talking to each other, really taking the issue seriously, and having a bunch of public discourse along the lines of what we're doing right here, and coming to sound public judgment under those circumstances. And there's no sort of finger on the scale like there would be in the liberal model against conscription or in the Republican model towards conscription, but rather saying, look, this is for us to decide. We're the ultimate judges of what the proper relationship should be. For whatever it's worth, I'm very sympathetic to this more deliberative, small d democratic model, and think that there's no way to decide this ahead of time, and that it really comes down to what an informed citizenry decides with its political leaders through proper sort of channels. Now, we can inform our discussion via sort of historical examples and the great arguments that people had, starting with the Roman Republic and Charlemagne. You had to be in the military to own property, all the way forward to the discussions of the liberal model in the 18th and 19th century. So that's sort of my opening thoughts on the matter.
Sure. I haven't given this question really a lot of thought, but what jumps out at me when I hear this is the question of, is there an obligation to participate? Just to set the record straight, I'm here as a member of the AVF Forum and not as a member of the United States Air Force, so I'm not sure they would appreciate some of my remarks today. But in any case, I also want to apologize to my senior commanders, General H. and Colonel Basovich. I did not desert to the Air Force. I have spent 30 years in the Army, but I am today working for the Air Force as a command historian of a very elite organization at Patrick Air Force Base. We monitor all nuclear treaty activities in the world. We're the ones who fly against North Korean tests, gather up samples, and then inform the President of the United States and the NSC as to what's going on with nuclear matters. So we attract some of the best and brightest. And to answer this question and others, I hope we can get to the opinions and the lifestyle preferences of Generation Z sometime during this debate. But I want to reflect on you just really quickly in terms of whether it's an obligation to participate or not. And looking at Generation Z, I think if you asked this question in the 1940s, you'd get a totally different answer than if you asked this question today. In my mind, having interviewed more than 100 first-term airmen in my organization, is it right for us to ask them to go on threat of being put in the penitentiary if they don't, to go participate in an immoral war? These Generation Z folks, I'm telling you, they largely view the war in Iraq as being an unjust war. Okay? And is it right to ask them to go participate that on fear of being imprisoned if they don't? To participate in a war where they may kill somebody, and they're not dumb. They've grown up amidst permanent war, perpetual war. It's a norm for them. And so if they do enlist, and what's the price point of their enlistment? $40,000 today? They're going to enlist and go to a war that's permanent? We're never leaving Afghanistan. What's the end state? Are they going to go back to Iraq, an unjust war? What's the price point for you young Gen Zers? Is it $100,000 to enlist? Is it $200,000 to enlist? Is that worth doing those things? And so I'll just leave you with that. I think the context matters. I think historical context matters. And I think this has a lot of ramifications for our national security policy. If you want to continue to participate in wars we don't win, if you want to continue to participate in unjust and immoral wars, then how are you going to attract the quality people that you want to have to do those things?
Let me try to add 2 points, I guess. One about the nature of common defense and the other about democracy. I think we often have an image in our head when we talk about the obligation to participate in the common defense of a barricade under siege, and every person has to be on the wall to defend against this, and that everyone needs then to share equal burden. And I think if we lived in a country like Israel or maybe even South Korea, that metaphor would work. That would be our condition. There would be enemies at the gate, and everyone needs to muster. But in my adult lifetime in the United States, we've never faced that situation. We've pretty much been involved in wars in a Cold War era in the periphery, whether they were Korea or Vietnam, over which there was a lot of discussion about whether they were moral or immoral, essential to our national defense or not. When I was young, we were told if we lost in Vietnam, there would be serious consequences. When I was in the government, we worried often about communist inroads in places like Angola, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Cambodia. By the way, the communists are in power still to this day in every one of those countries. And somehow our country has survived. And it seems to me there's a lot of discussion in hindsight. I didn't realize it was quite as fierce among young people right now about whether when you're my age, you're going to look back at Afghanistan and Iraq and wonder the same things about how central they were to the common defense. So in my view, we do have an obligation to muster to the common defense. But we have to also then have confidence that our political process in democracy is identifying real threats and mobilizing us towards causes that really make sense for us to pay that sacrificial price, particularly when the likelihood that we are going to have attacks on the homeland are low. I think one of the reasons we were able to move to an all-volunteer force is the notion that in the Cold War and in a strategic standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States, or even today between Russia, China, and the United States, if that war comes in a direct way, the difference between the home front and the front lines are going to narrow real fast, like they did in London during World War II, or Paris in World War II. And everyone, I think, will come to the barricades. The only time we've had an attack directly on the homeland here in my adult lifetime is 9/11. And people came to the barricades with so much emotion. We went into a war in Iraq, a country that had very little to do with 9/11, and is, I think, partly the precipitating cause for why we're sitting in this room today, because it broke the all-volunteer force. And prior to that, we were able to sustain our national security commitments in these other wars with the all-volunteer force. But if we're going to be at a permanent war in many places around the world, the last point the other side I want to think about here is democracy. There has been a decline, and I have a colleague in my department, I should have maybe asked to be here as well, who has this wonderful chart of the decline in trust in our institutions by the general public across the last 25 or 30 years. And it's a very sharp decline in the trust in government. The Congress is just at the bottom. Higher education. The military does a little better, but of course if trust in the military was sky high, again we wouldn't be sitting in this room. Right? Everyone would be going into it. The confidence that the government is making decisions in our interest. Last weekend, thousands of students marching all over this country, convinced that money seems to drive the Congress, even if it means they get shot in school. And an enormous frustration, the lack of voice in our democracy of common people. What Francis Chen was saying maybe about the Trump supporters' anger over elites making decisions to commit them all over the world to wars that they are not sure were in our interest. I think they increasingly think the processes of decision-making are either run by elites, maybe elites who aren't even Americans, or who have interests of foreign countries in mind and committing us and our power to their defense. So coming back, I'll finish here. Before we really would be able to answer this question, I guess I'm closest to your third model, Michael, I'd have to have more confidence that some of the problems in the democratic system in the United States have been dealt with before I would want to grant more power to the current government to conscript or limit the freedom of our citizens and then to compel them to go to wherever the next war might be.
Great, thanks very much. I want to sort of push a little bit farther on this question about sort of obligations to serve and how American society views this, and connecting back to Mike's point about the sort of liberal versus the Republican models, and Lieutenant Colonel Young's point about what you saw as this big generational shift. And at least one way that I think I could bring together those two comments is it sounds like Colonel Young, you're suggesting that you see this shift in the American public from what used to be kind of a Republican model to a more liberal model. And I guess I wanted to ask the other panelists if you sort of shared that view, and I guess maybe I wanted to push back a little bit against it, just pointing at some of the data that we saw earlier this morning about how, for example, with the inequality, that there was already substantial inequality in terms of who was serving and dying in Vietnam, right? So, and that's not millennials. That's been going on since that's been going on since the Korean War. So, is this really about a generational change, or is it about the kinds of things that Rick Herrmann was talking about what are the missions that people are being asked to do, and nobody wants to rush to the barricades for this stuff?
Sure. Okay. You know, my interests to date have been on the propensity to serve. Okay, and Dr. Bailey's, I think, brought this point out well this morning, is that as long as the numbers you need remain relatively low, I don't think this is a major issue. But if we're talking about perhaps a second Korean War, for example, or God forbid another immoral, unjust war, and we have no choice but to bring back conscription, is it fair or moral for this country to ask this generation to go, when you look at the characteristics of this generation? The reason I got into all this was 4 years ago, and I'll tell you a short little story. I'm in this elite unit. We attract airmen who are in the top 5% of their scores. You have to have 90 on the AFSSB to get in, to even be considered in this career field. Many of our airmen have science degrees. Enlisted folks have science degrees in physics, radiochemistry, meteorology. And yet the commander came to me very, very concerned, seriously concerned 4 years ago, that there was a sense of apathy throughout our enlisted corps that was he thought was a hindrance to our mission. No, very little esprit de corps, no unit cohesion, and when 4:30 came around, there wasn't an airman to be seen. Okay, because they had another life, they had another lifestyle that they went off to. So he asked me to dig into this, hoping that there was some historical things that we could do to start to make some headway into this awareness of how rich our heritage and our history was, and how special it was to be an airman in our unit. So I took on that challenge, and over the last 4 years, I've read every book, every manuscript, every article I could get my hands on about the late millennial generation and Generation Z, and I see Generation Z folks in here. And here's what I'll tell you. Here's what I'll conclude, and I won't go into a lot of data here. But the youngest millennial is now 22 years old. So we're now well into Generation Z, or whatever they're going to be called, and some of you are in this room, and those are the ones who are 21 years or less. And so those are the primary stakeholders of the AVF. All of us others, we have skin in the game, but we're no longer eligible to enlist. So if we're trying to recruit the top-tier citizens of this country, what is it about our institutional cultures that makes them want to join those? I've discovered that in talking to over 100 airmen and probably 24 lieutenants in their first assignments, that they believe that, here's what I've concluded, that there is a civil-military gap, okay, but it's not between those who serve and those who don't serve among the Generation Z. This gap exists between the archaic institutional cultures, especially in the Army and the Marine Corps, and Generation Z at large. They're unwilling, I think, to change or to approach this youngest generation and figure out what are their values, what are their lifestyles. Because we've always seen generation distinctions before, but I would argue that this one's the greatest, because Generation Z is changing our society's culture at the speed of light. We're being left, the rest of us are being left in the dust. And so when you look at the propensity to serve or lack thereof, I would argue that our airmen do not express a propensity to serve. They express a propensity to be employed, okay? Because they haven't quite figured out what they want to do with their lives, and they don't trust our institutions. They don't even see job security in wearing a uniform. A couple years ago, the Army got rid of a lot of mid-grade NCOs because we didn't need them anymore. People who had already dedicated 10 years of their life, thrown out. There's no job security, okay? They're trying to figure all this out, okay? And I think that, when we looked at our retention rates over the last 4 years, they were not as high as they should have been, okay? There is a solution to this, folks, and the only one I think who got this was former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, who came forth in January 2016 with a whole slew of personnel reforms. And although people like me who are personnel reform advocates didn't think he went far enough, he was immediately crucified in Congress and by the service chiefs by being too liberal in his approach. So if the services, my argument is the services have to change both liberally and radically their institutional cultures, which are still deeply rooted, in the Army's case, to pre-Vietnam era stuff. Okay? And so I would be very curious, asking the Generation Z people here today, as you consider your questions this afternoon, what would entice you when you graduate from college to accept a commission in the Army or the Marine Corps? More importantly, with what you know about our armed services cultures, what would they have to change for you to want to join them? Okay? I'll just leave it at that. And I think that we're not paying enough attention to this. And lifestyles, I'll tell you, our airmen, although they do a great job for this nation, they have another life. It is just a job, Dr. Bailey. It's a job for them. Okay? And so how do we recruit a quality force if they can't relate to those institutional cultures?
Sure. So I think one way of framing the question, if we're going to stay focused on conscription versus an all-volunteer force, is to ask a question that, and I apologize, I wasn't able to make most of the morning sessions, but I've gathered this question of what's special about military service came up. But I'll just emphasize that military service and the idea of conscription, I racked my brain, and the only other thing that I can think of that modern democratic states compel people to do, let's just take the United States, is jury service. In terms of time. You have to pay your taxes and do all kinds of things, of course. But in terms of, no, you must be here at this time and date to do this kind of service, pretty much the only thing that we compel people to do is jury service. And that only if you want to vote. If you're not in the voter rolls, you don't have to do that. And it seems to me that it's just completely a different order of magnitude in terms of the kind of commitment. We're talking about a day or two every few years versus 2 years of your life or more. And so it seems to me that this question of what's unique about military service as opposed to, say, serving on a police force or fire department or another dangerous job becomes particularly acute. And here I just want to echo something that I think Rick was saying, which is I do think if you look at the history of political thought, that everybody agrees, or almost everybody agrees, that there's something very special about protecting ourselves from being conquered by a foreign power, preserving fundamental security and sovereignty. But it's not so clear at all that it's special in that intense sense that would get us over this bar to more generally promote American interests, protect our allies, or preserve our unilateral superpower status. That seems to me to be two very different questions and have two very different thresholds about an expectation as being a basic expectation of citizenship. And under those circumstances, it's not that clear to me that standing conscription, I'll tell a slightly embarrassing personal anecdote. When I was 18, I'm doubly embarrassed to say, I don't know whether this is still the case, but when I was 18, I had to register for the draft, and I had no problem with that. I even considered ROTC for college. Was not and am not in any way anti-military, but I went to register to vote, and in the state of Illinois at the time, I don't know if it's still true, you couldn't register if you were a man. You couldn't register to vote until you proved that you had registered for the Selective Service. And I was a very sort of fiery, person standing on principle, and I said, no, the 26th Amendment is precisely about being able to vote before you're committed to having to serve in the military. And so I refused to register for the Selective Service until I could register for the draft, or register to vote. And ultimately, they were going to take away my student aid to college, and so my principles wilted rather shamefully. But it is to say that I think a lot of, and I think that particular commitment was idiosyncratic to me, but I think a lot of people's attitude is, sure, if I'm able to be part of the democratic process, and I think that the democratic process is working properly vis-a-vis these sorts of commitments, and if we're really talking about, there was a spike after 9/11 because there was an attack, a consequential attack that came onto our shores, right? Under those circumstances, I think the vast majority of people would think that there is cause for conscription if we really need that level of force. Manpower, person power to be able to repel threats. But I suspect, and the history of political thought would, I think, agree with this, that we really have to make a distinction between what's sort of projecting American power in a generic sense and what's really contributing to the defense of in security and sovereignty of the homeland. And my hunch is that some of the generational change we see is that if we go back to, say, the World War II generation, America wasn't a unilateral superpower before the beginning of World War II. And World War II did really seem like a global threat to the security of advanced democracies, and that it took us time to sort of see that some of the other conflicts we were getting involved with didn't have that character to them. So my hunch is it's not so much the kids are different these days or anything along those lines, so much as it's a social learning process in the context of a pretty serious change in how America has deployed its military might.
I think it was this summer or early fall was the first chance I had the opportunity to talk with Dr. Lieutenant Colonel Young, and we had a wonderful conversation. And he asked me this question, since he was studying Generation Z and interviewing many people in the military, he asked me, what about the students I know who aren't in the military? What do they think? What is their, and I've been teaching here for 35 years, and one of the great things about that is everyone I'm working with is always between about 18 and 22 years old, so I always feel like perpetually I'm about 26 or 27. But I've seen over, many years, a lot of young people come through, some similarities and some differences. But let me, at risk of gross generalizations, let me just say, because you asked me, what do they think they're doing if they're not joining the military? And I can sort of relate some of what I hear often. I think students want to make an important contribution with their life, more all the time. And I'm not sure they think the military is necessarily the best avenue for doing that. I think some of them think that for maybe the institutional reasons you think, or maybe as Professor Bailey was saying this morning, when you look at the country and what you can do to serve the country, there's just a lot of variety in different ways. And if we're going to organize the talent in the country, maybe this is an argument in the 70s all over again, does it really make sense to take some of our most talented people, say, who are our next generation nerds who are going to develop the next thing like the internet that revolutionizes us, and tell them to spend 2 years in the Marine Corps? Or would we as a country be better off telling them, go to college early, get yourself in a position to make the maximum brain power contribution you can make going forward to us, get trained, because you're much more valuable to us highly trained than you are before you've been trained in that regard. And so maybe from a broad macro, what's in the best national interest perspective, we want to let a lot of freedom, maybe I'm a liberal here, a lot of freedom to let the market do its thing and people make their own choices, as opposed to the government deciding what's the best use of talent in the United States and where to channel it. In my lifetime, the Soviet Union was a highly bureaucratized, highly hierarchical, militarized institution that tried to manage its economy. It conscripted its people, of course. And I don't think the Cold War was won by the United States because we defeated it militarily. I've already indicated most of the wars that we've been engaged in my lifetime through the Cold War, we didn't win. The communists still are in power in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Angola, Nicaragua. We didn't win those wars. The stalemate at the nuclear level, we may have won that, sort of, if you can win at a nuclear stalemate level, but we're still basically at a nuclear strategic stalemate with Russia and China. And in the central front of Europe, by the time I was a young man in the middle 70s, we were already fairly stable. We had a lot of force there. But neither we or the Soviet Union was challenging any kind of hot confrontation. And I was working for the Secretary of State when the Cold War ended. It wasn't ended because of arms control. It ended because the Soviet Union saw that it couldn't compete in the high frontier economically, that the rest of the world was leaving it behind. Its educational system, every dimension of its economy was simply outclassed by 100 times by what they saw in the United States, Western Europe, Japan. And the moral of the story started to be, what kind of countries seem to have the most national power? And they weren't the ones that necessarily devoted a large portion of their population to mandatory military service, because that wasn't the coin of the realm in modern international competition. We at the law school last week had a major conference on the threat the United States faces potentially from quantum computing. And it was impressive, the kind of threats we face going forward. I don't know how, and again, I'm agnostic. I'm looking for the students to help me this afternoon think through what's the best way to prepare our country to wrestle with both foreign intrusion into our electoral processes, shutting down our infrastructure, or whatever might come. But it's not likely to come, I think, with Chinese or Russian troops landing on our shores. And we're not going to be able to confront it with a metaphor in our mind of a national security establishment that's going to fight it with Marines of the traditional warfighting variety. I worry. Anyway, that's enough for this.
Thanks very much. I want to follow up on that and on the point about the sort of kind of declining inclination to serve, I guess was the phrase that Lieutenant Colonel Young used, and ask all all of the panelists if they had any thoughts about whether this sort of declining, to what extent you all see this declining inclination to serve as a function of broader shifts in moral values in American society. Has there been a decline of patriotism? Are we not as patriotic a country as we were 50 years ago? Or is it more driven by a loss of confidence in American political institutions that Dr. Herman was talking about, and in particular, loss of confidence in American institutions' ability to decide about when and how to use force? Is that sort of at the root of what this declining inclination to serve is being driven by?
I think there is a decline, and I think the Harvard IOP poll that came out in December backs up some of these assertions with some of their data, as well as the Pew Research.
When you say decline, you mean decline in patriotism?
Yes, there is a significant decline in patriotism, and you can look at that in a number of ways. I mean, I guess it depends on how you define patriotism. I think growing up in the late 60s, early 70s, I viewed it one way, probably different from the latest generation views it. But the poll has some very interesting data that I think shows how these demographics have significantly changed. And just a summary of those very quickly is these are some of the common characteristics that Gen Z has expressed in terms of this conversation. They do question authority extensively. I would say they're hyper inquisitive and hyper innovative. In terms of less patriotism, they take by a margin of more than 2-to-1 a liberal stand on almost any social issue that we could talk about today. They're very cosmopolitan in their worldviews, and I think their social media has enabled them to become pretty expert at that. Globalization is something they embrace. They don't reject it like the current administration does. They certainly do not buy into Trump's America First rhetoric. Politics, they're even less interested than millennials were. But when they do take an interest, by a margin of more than 2-to-1, they believe that Congress should be controlled by the Democratic Party. And this is what struck me in terms of the patriotism question, they believe that we will always be a nation of immigrants, and that the greatest threat to the United States, by a large margin, comes from inside the country, not outside. And they see any system in the United States and any institution in the United States as somewhat broken because they've grown up watching the dysfunctionality of all of our major institutions and systems. For you professors out there, they see much less value in a traditional college degree. Okay? They reject the sages on the stages, and they want you to facilitate their acquisition of knowledge rather than dictate it. I was speaking to a young lieutenant last week who graduated from the Air Force Academy 18 months ago. She's a chemist, so I didn't expect her to be super interested in history, but I asked her how she liked her history classes because I used to teach at the Air Force Academy. And she was pretty outraged by how she hated it. And I asked her why. And she said she could have gotten all that information herself online in 1/5 of the time, and she resented being dictated to in her classes. Those are the kinds of people we're dealing with today, and their attitudes generally. I mean, it's generalizations are hard to nail down, but that's what the latest data from Pew and Harvard say.
So my worry is that Pew was measuring nationalism and nativism and not patriotism. And I realize this is I'm opening a can of worms here. But it seems to me it's utterly consistent, to be patriotic and question authority. There are construals of what a responsible citizen of the United States consists in that would require you to question authority. Considering us a nation of immigrants, it seems to me is utterly consistent with one of the powerful narratives of what the American ideal is. There's a powerful counter-narrative to that as well, This is actually a bit of a pet peeve of mine, so I apologize if I'm coming on a bit strong here. But it seems to me that patriotism should be understood as a commitment to the core ideals of one's nation state and a willingness to sacrifice personally in order to advance those. The questions and measures that you referred to, it seemed to me, are very far from cleanly tapping that, and are much more about nationalism and nativism. And I should add, I don't necessarily think, I think, for whatever it's worth, I do think nativism to some extent should be a pejorative term, but I don't think nationalism in itself is necessarily a term of abuse. But patriotism is, what in political theory is called an evaluative descriptive concept, meaning in one sense it describes people, but in describing them, it intrinsically praises them. If we say that somebody is courageous, we're describing them in a certain way, but we're describing them in a way that everybody knows and implicitly believes is praising them. And that's why it seems to me it's very important to be careful about how we define patriotism and not just cede it to a particular ideological framework, and make it possible for anyone who broadly subscribes to a plausible narrative of American national identity to be able to claim patriotism. To me, it's an open question as to whether Generation Z is less patriotic in the sense that I care about and that I think is normatively important. I don't know of good systematic evidence as to whether they're more or less patriotic in the sense that I think is important. My hunch is I'm a little bit skeptical of, and I don't think this is what you're saying. I want to be clear about this, but I'm a little bit skeptical of kids these days arguments. I suspect the vast majority of what's happening is there's a change of social conditions that are the background to these sorts of questions. After, I don't know if it came up earlier, but I think one of the single and simplest things we should do is enforce the War Powers Act. That it's not just that we've lost the last several wars or not been particularly successful in the last several wars, is that they haven't been declared wars. It hasn't gone through popular democratic channels in any straightforward sense of the term. And I suspect if proper democratic procedures were followed, my hunch, and this is completely speculative, is that we'd have less of it, and B, that we'd have more support, and more support even from the young people who were calling on to sacrifice in order to conduct those sorts of operations, and that there's not been a fundamental change in human nature or the character of young people in the United States, but rather in the background conditions that inform their decisions to support or oppose various sorts of actions of the government and beliefs about whether they can properly invest their trust in the government.
I don't have a lot to add. I just want to make one point, that I think the levels of nationalism that we see are context-driven. If we were holding this in March of 2002, I think we'd think they were sky high. We saw a huge rally of patriot sentiment, even ethnocentric American nationalism, and as my colleague John Mueller has showed many times, you get a rally, and then the rally declines. But we're now more than 15 years away. The threat is evolved. The salience of that threat has declined, And so I think the display of nationalism and patriotism with it is lower right now, although when we get shocks to the system, you'll get it. That's just one point. I think this is not only easy to generalize, I don't think it's an intrinsic property of the body politic. I think it's the degree to which they see threat as salient, and when they see salient threats, it goes up. The other thing I want to say is that I think the country right now, everybody says this, is divided, it's polarized. I don't know how you can watch Fox News and not think that its audience is highly nationalistic. I mean, this is U.S. government boosterism all day, every day. And American nationalism on display since Fox News came onto the airwaves. And it still, as I understand it, has a viewership 3 times CNN or the other news cable networks. So I think there's a very large appetite for American nationalistic feelings. I think the current president taps into that. I think there's a widespread sentiment for American power, and don't mess with us, and if you do, we'll knock you around badly. Now, whether that translates into actual willingness to serve and actual follow through on the threats and the commitments we make worries me a lot, because I'm not sure that is there. And I also worry that this kind of display of American nationalism that we're seeing from many parts of the population right now, it can be a threat to democracy, because they come to define, like, we're real Americans, and the rest of you guys should shut up, because you're not a real American because you look different than me, or you're not a real patriot because you weren't in the military or whatever. And they define more narrowly and narrowly who they think really is a nationalist and a patriot and should have a say. And I see that argument in the country as a very dangerous thing for a healthy democracy. Last thing I want to say, there's a lot of appreciation, I think, unlike when I was younger, for people who are serving in the military. So there's this, I don't remember as many celebratory events on television. Every television show I can think of these days has veteran heroes. 24, the most obvious example, but it's pervasive in the Hollywood culture right now. Someone mentioned earlier at football games, basketball games, there's this display of appreciation. It doesn't translate into willingness to serve, but I also don't think it's utterly insincere. I think it comes from a patriotic sense of appreciation for the great sacrifice people have made.
Before we go into the other question, I'll just say something briefly, because there's an innovation in political theory that I think is really important. It's about the last 15 years or so on this question. I won't get too much into the technical philosophy, but there's a movement towards what's called constitutional patriotism. So the idea is that the object of your patriotic commitments is not blood or land, or let's just say blood or land or peoplehood. It's commitment to the constitutional peoples that constitute us as a people, as a nation, and to the history of trying to live up to those ideals. Interestingly, this idea comes from a German philosopher who's kind of a center-left German philosopher, in a rare turn, loves the United States, at least on this particular criterion, because he says, look, the German national anthem still says Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. And his point is, look, that got us into a ton of trouble. That led to moral catastrophe. The Americans had this right. What it means to be patriotic is to come and subscribe to the American creed. And that there's a certain sense in which Thanksgiving is specifically for immigrants. It's not for daughters of the American Revolution and the sons of the Confederacy especially. It's for the people that came here and say, no, my allegiance is to the Constitution and the historical attempt to live up to the best ideals embedded in that Constitution, and that's what patriotism means. if you can't tell, I'm extremely sympathetic to this view and feel strongly that that's the conception of patriotism that we should promote among young people, rather than and really distinguish it from nationalism and certainly from nativism.
Just a little thing on that point that is like a hobby horse for me. Along those lines is I think it's sometimes lost that the president's oath of office is to defend the Constitution,
Yep.
not to defend the American people.
Same for all soldiers, seamen, airmen, and Marines.
And so the highest oath of office is not to keep you safe or to prevent you from being killed in a terrorist attack or something like that. The highest oath of office is to protect the Constitution. But anyway, I'll get off my hobby horse. So we've talked a lot about sort of the supply of military force or resources that the United States will or won't be able to draw upon in the future. And I wanted to shift the conversation a little bit to ask about what you all see as the demand for the use of force going forward. What is the task that the American military is going to need to be ready to serve going into the future? And so toward that end, do you all see threats that are likely to require a larger military in the future, or are we going to have to sustain the kind of military that we have now long term? Or on the other hand, do you feel like actually, the United States could remain as secure with a smaller military? I mean, as we saw from some of the from some of the presentations this morning, that some of the strain on both on the AVF and on the draft, the strain on both systems came when there were these sort of extensive military commitments. So do you see large threats that we need to face in the future, or can we step back? Anybody who wants?
I had a chance to listen to General Clapper a couple weeks ago, and these questions arose, and I found it very interesting to hear his views on how he would answer the threat question. I was very surprised that he did not see North Korea as the top two threats to this nation right now. He sees in the short term Russia, and in the long term China as being those threats. But to answer your question, just very briefly, I think whether it requires a larger military in the future or not depends on the type of conflict we get involved in, and whether that conflict is viewed as being just, or is it just another in a series of interventions that may never end. And I like to just leave it at that, because I think that's the fundamental question. And we were talking last night, Dr. Herman, about if there was another major conflict, would America's youth rise to that challenge? And that is a very difficult question to answer, I think.
We don't have any experience in our lifetimes of where that was really tested. I guess I'd say this. Sure, there are real challenges the United States faces. Obviously, we are far from extricated from the Middle East. We have all kinds of issues still to worry about there, and in Asia with China also, and in Russia certainly. But I think that we tend to translate foreign policy challenges into military threats too quickly and too easily. I think one of the greatest strategists of our time was a man named George Kennan, who really defined a lot of how we ended up interacting with the Soviet Union. But much to his frustration as he left government, people decided that we needed to build a NATO and add Germany to that, and understand NATO as a military alliance. It was going to militarily defeat the Soviet Union, something that by 1956 he thought was just stupid beyond belief, that it was completely misunderstood what the actual threat of communism was and how we would successfully deal with it. And that because total war in a direct way among great powers in the modern world is crazy, given the nuclear stalemate, you need to think about the nature of the competition we face, whether it's with Russia or China, in much broader terms than just, are we going to duke it out over the sands of Iwo Jima? Because that's not likely the way it's going to go. And consequently, I think when we tend to see, so I do see threats. The other point I want to make is that having said that, I am more worried that we've inflated threats in the last 20, in the students' lifetimes. We've told you that terrorism is an existential threat to your existence and to the existence of this country. Something I don't think is true. And I think we've told you that other threats are existential threats to our very survival. Maybe that Saddam Hussein is going to have a nuclear weapon. We see nuclear clouds over Chicago. Something that our government talked about, or leaders of our government 15 years ago. Well, sure, we can terrify ourselves and others with worst case scenarios of what could go wrong. But it would seem to me we need a sensible foreign policy that engages these countries, engages these threats, and not necessarily just say, because North Korea's got, it's going to be a problem. Yeah. No doubt about that. What I'm going to caution you against is you think tonight, the solution to that is not necessarily that we're going to go knock them out militarily. So yes, I see threats. I think I'm more worried they're going to be inflated rather than deflated. It seems to me that our government, I'm not quite sure why, is set up these days to inflate threats of all kinds. I mean, I understand why the military leadership often inflates threats. I mean, for those who don't know, one of the reasons we created the CIA and initially took it outside the standing military was because the assumption was among the lawyers setting this up, the standard military would obviously have a vested interest in inflating threats for budgetary reasons. And you would want your threat analysis to be done by a unit that presumably was free of those budgetary incentives. Now, the system in the practice at this point in the world is very different than that. The CIA, has, especially since 9/11, has adopted quite a large operational component to itself, and it's doing lots of things on the operational side that might have a vested interest to pump the budget pump. But I'm not quite sure why the rest of the government has been also, I think, inflating the threats we face around the world rather than helping Americans sort of take a more careful and reasoned thought about how are we going to wrestle with this, how are we going to deal with this. So I do think, Chris, we will definitely need a military, we'll definitely need a large military, but when you'll get a prompt this afternoon that General Lation and I worked out, and within it, I guess we couldn't resist mentioning China and Russia, right? To frighten you, I guess. So I want to counter. Okay, but they are out there, and we as sensible people need to think that yes, we will face threats. Yes, we will need a military. How big determines on how you want to take on those threats, and how you think they're going to manifest themselves.
So I have virtually no competence to speak to the question of the scope of threats. I will say at a personal level, I'm sympathetic to what the Colonel and Professor Herman said, but I will sort of reprise. I'm a democratic constitutional proceduralist. That's my core commitment. I think that's the right way to think about how to run a democracy and political theory. And one thing that I think I sort of, in passing, referred to the War Powers Act, but I think this is really important. The Constitution is very clear about who gets to declare war, and the Congress tried to tighten that up, and it seems to just be routinely ignored. And my hunch, as an empirical matter, but here again I'm sort of amateuring, is that we would see much less. We would see a narrower scope for the projection of force if this had to go through standard political channels that involve the Congress, which after all is the popular branch of government. So that's what, it's not speaking directly to Chris's empirical question, but that's my contribution to this question.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right about the way we've bypassed the sort of constitutional procedure. The catch that I would put that I would sort of throw on top of that is I think we've largely done that because Congress wanted us to do that. They wanted to punt and not have to take responsibility for those decisions. So
I think that that's right, but we have to, as citizens, hold their feet
Hold
to the
them,
fire
yeah.
and say, no, we elected you to make these
to
decisions.
do this, right?
And you're going to be accountable for them.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we've talked about a lot of interesting sort of broad issues, but I know for this afternoon, you students are going to have to actually try to come up with some concrete things to do and what we should do differently. So I wanted to sort of shift the conversation a little bit to ask people on the panel about what kinds of solutions you all might see as different ways forward to kind of give the students for this afternoon some fuel to think about it. We talked about what the supply of sort of military resources, the human resources to the military is likely to be, what the threats might be. How do you all see that we should try to balance these things out? And I could think of a couple of different directions that we could push things in terms of policies that we could implement. We could reinstate a draft of some sort, right? We could have maybe through a lottery or something like that. We could have a requirement of some sort of service, maybe that would include either the military or work in Peace Corps or some other sort of thing like that. We could also go a different direction, and we could say we are just going to have an explicitly mercenary force. We're going to develop, the American version of the French Foreign Legion, and maybe the extent to which we've privatized already a lot of military functions might be seen as a step in that direction. So I'm just interested to hear from y'all about what direction do you think we need to move in order to bring the kind of supply that we have of human resources for the military and the demands that we place on the military as an institution in terms of missions, how should we bring those into alignment?
Well, I think you summarized very well really the gist of what the AVF Forum is all about, because we have voiced over the last 3 years any of those, or discussed any of those possible courses of action. Okay, but the devil's in the details. And I'd like the students, I side with Professor Basovich on this, that I would much rather see some form of organized national service than a return of the draft. And I would like to ask the students, from what I see, you're already doing national service. Look at what you do when you come out of high school to apply to go to university. You've shown your community service hours, right? You've shown some of the volunteer work you've done, right? So is it, I know the devil's in the details on standing up a system of national service, but I would like to ask you, you're already doing those things, much more than my generation did. And so can that be organized? Can that be constructed? And is it just another bureaucratic layer on our government to try to administer a system like that or not?
Michael, did you want to?
I missed the question.
Okay, I'll do. I don't want to steal the thunder. Also, I don't have good answers. That's why I organized this afternoon to see if there were more creative ideas among the next generation. I did want to. I guess I will say I think that one of the risks I see in larger scale national service, and certainly conscription into the military, is the socialization of a larger portion of the population into worldview that's coming from the government. And I actually, the older I get, maybe it's been the nature of the government, or maybe I just know more about it, the more skeptical I am, because I'll talk for myself. When I was in the government, I was given a mission to do certain things. The senator from California in the early part of the 19th century, Hiram Warren Johnson, said, at least he's attributed to saying, the first casualty of war is truth. And I think that's because very often governments decide we have a mission, and then they have smart people around them who have a mission assigned to them, and actually telling the truth is not the central part of that mission. Very often mobilizing the public convincing our public we're in the right and convincing foreign publics that they're in the wrong, convincing our allies to come along with us, convincing our adversaries that we will defeat them if they challenge us. That becomes the mission. And we work to achieve that mission. And sometimes we tell the truth, and sometimes we omit, and sometimes we shape and spin and do what we can to mobilize public support for what we're trying to do, or mobilize other kinds of bargaining situations. And the narratives that are used when we do that in the government are serving a mission of the government, because when you're working in the government, you have a client. It's the American people. And that's kind of different than when you're in the academy. You don't quite have that same client, so to speak, that hired you to pursue its mission. And that means that the ways of thinking about these conflicts are pretty patriotic. They're pretty straightforward. These are the guys that are helping us achieve this. They're often called good guys. And actually, good guys and bad guys is not words you would never hear. You hear them all the time about who are good guys and bad guys. It gets simplified that much. Who's on our side, who's not, who's contributing to this. It's not a question whether they're right or wrong. It's whether they're helpful or they're not helpful. And then, you know, you're socializing people, and very often it's not. I remember having a conversation as a quite young man with someone who General Larry Wilkinson worked with closely, Colin Powell, who told me when I was working in the government, he thought it was very important that he knew, he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, that he knew his counterparts on the other side of the Cold War divide. But he wasn't so sure he wanted his troops to have that same sense of personal connection to people on the other side. Because they were going to maybe have to do things and not really worry about whether they're doing the right thing, the wrong thing, whether they're hurting people or not. That's something us political leaders need to keep always at the front of your mind. It's not necessarily the case, though, that when you're mobilizing and you're deploying, you're doing certain things, that you need to share all the moral complexities, all the difficult decisions with everyone all the way down the chain. That's just not conducive to the mission, and it's not conducive actually to the psychological well-being of the people who are fulfilling the tasks you've asked them to do. The reason I dwell on this a little bit is we've been talking about democracy. The country needs to come and have a fulsome discussion about whether we're going to engage in some of these places, and maybe very near future Iran or North Korea. And I worry that so much of the conversation nowadays is shaped by the handouts that come to the press from the press secretaries at state, the Pentagon, or other foreign governments, and where the national conversation gets reduced to very heavily dependent on these same kind of simplistic stereotypes, simplistic arguments that are used for mobilization that then they become pass for serious analysis of what's going on. And I'm sometimes worried. You mentioned about the culture of the military. I won't say more about that, but I don't know that I want a larger and larger percent of the American public socialized in its most impressionable years by the military. I guess I'm an old-fashioned liberal that was this way in the 70s. I'm just not sure that's healthy for the well-being of democracy.
Okay, well, Art and Mike, I didn't want to cut you off. Do you have anything?
I stepped out
Yeah,
during the question, so I'm not sure.
That's fine. I was just asking about sort of policy solutions going forward to here to sort of get the conversation started from that. But at this point, you all have listened to a lot of discussion, and I wanted to open it up to the audience to let you ask questions of our panelists here of things that are on the top of your mind, and in particular, as General Leish offered earlier, I'd like to ask students first if you have anything that you'd like to ask the panelists on any of the issues that we've touched on, or whatever's sort of at the top of your mind. So we'll go with the young one back there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, my question pertains, I've really been gravitating towards what Dr. Lieutenant Colonel Young has said about pretty much just what would it take for somebody like me to join the armed forces, the military, the Air Force. And I've actually thought about it at some depth. And the reason I've thought about it is because, in short, not to make a personal anecdote too personal, but my education cost me over $100,000. And I recently took a job with AmeriCorps doing Teach for America because of the fact that they promised me something along the lines of federal loan forbearance, and student debt deferral, because quite frankly, I think nowadays the American dream is expensive. That the ideal that you're supposed to go right into higher education, I didn't have any help except for the help I got from the federal government, which I'm extremely grateful for. And that's kind of been promoting some of my thoughts to join the armed forces a little bit. So I didn't know if that comes up a lot in some of the conversation you've had with some of these Generation Z people about, what would it take? It doesn't necessarily have to be about numbers, but some of the promises involved.
First of all, congratulations on being accepted into that program. I know it's very competitive, and I applaud you for stepping forward and doing something for the nation. I have had those conversations with some of our airmen and our junior officers, and I want to make a distinction here, is that they have come out of college, especially the ones who didn't go to the Air Force Academy or didn't have a full scholarship in our OTC, but more importantly, the enlisted folks, and there are quite a few who have college degrees in the hard sciences. And they're there because of the very same reason that you just cited, but they're not there, Dr. Bailey, because they're accepting a bounty to join. It's a job. It's an interim step. It's not an enticement. It's just a way to address that real world problem. And maybe they'll stay, and maybe they won't stay. Okay, but in my mind, I'm watching them go through an experiment. Right? They're constantly asking questions. We've created a climate in our organization where it's a command climate to try to raise these retention rates to where it's safe for you to question anything. And having spent 30 years in the Army, we just didn't do that, right? If you questioned anything, if you were a minority, you were a non-team player, you just didn't get it, right? And we've also created innovation labs, and our retention rates are climbing because of that. And so I would argue that this debt problem that you're coming out of college with is a very real problem for this nation. And I don't have any suggestions on how you fix that. But I will tell you that going into programs like yours, and maybe spending 4 years in the Air Force or the Army, is a way to give a little bit back while you're solving that problem.
So I had a question about deliberative democracy and how a national discussion around more of the military in general would go, considering we have these inflated threats, the idea of like a government's mission that guides that, lack of top secret intel that the public just doesn't have access to, and then on top of that, we also have a weak democratic infrastructure where elites can really dominate with money, and education isn't available to everyone. So if we want to have a truly deliberative democracy and a conversation about military affairs, is that possible? And if it's not, how can we make that possible?
Great. I assume I should lead off on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very good question. The first thing I say in response to questions like that is relative to what? Right? So what you're pointing out is that a perfectly deliberative democracy seems way, very remote. And that's certainly right. What I would say is, rather than thinking of deliberative democracy as a set of face-to-face, real-time procedures of discussion like this, though I do consider this part of deliberative democracy, is rather thinking about standards for justification. And it's the quality of the discourse that we have politically that warrants believing that we've got justification to take public action. And that conversation is spread out in all kinds of ways. It's court opinions, it's testimony before Congress, it's editorial pages, it's also the great work that the AVF Forum is doing to stimulate, very directly and facially deliberative processes. It's all of that. And so it's one thing to recognize that there are impediments to realizing that at some ideal level. But then I say, relative to what? Just letting the government decide without significant input from the public? Letting intellectuals on a panel decide? I'm one of those who would be benefited, and I think that's a terrible idea. I never served in the military. I'm not an expert, so do we just take a referendum without really trying to stimulate high-quality discussion? I think that's a terrible idea, too. So it's one thing to point out that deliberative procedures are and are always going to be remote from, a really high quality seminar discussion. And it's quite another thing to say that we should abandon deliberative standards of legitimation and justification. And so then, so that's the kind of the answer to the first part of your question. So yes, money influences things, and the government tries to sort of mobilize people's emotions and fears. What I would say is that deliberative procedures, though not perfect, are precisely what we need to tamp those down. It's when people aren't really thinking and talking that you can just stimulate their automatic emotional reactions and bypass their rational processes. And it's discussions like this that partly insulate people against that and make them more informed. And if they read editorial debates, if that's precisely the situations where vested interests still are going to be more powerful, but they're going to be less powerful than they would have been had you not gone this route. As far as what we can do to engage that, there's a whole, this is what I do for a living. It's my life's work. And I'm not going to give you a discourse on my life's work. But I think there's a lot of things that can happen to help that. Part of it involves civic education. Part of it involves things like what you're doing here, which I think is a combination of really modeling discursive deliberative processes and doing it in the context of education for citizenship, which is why I agreed to do this, even though I'm not really an expert on this, is because I really believe in what everybody's trying to accomplish in this forum today.
Hi, in regards to the casualty gap, would it be more beneficial to try to work on institutionalized depression that we face in our society before trying to work on the military aspect of the situation? Just because it's if you only focus on that one little aspect of it, it's still perpetuated in the overall macro level of it. So
That's a really hard question, and I think when Dr. Shen finished, he was saying that it's not unique. It's not the only place in our society where there's inequality, and I agree with your point. I was thinking about what I might say because I knew inequality was going to be a theme we were going to talk about. A year ago or so, Michael Nebla would know better. The campus spent an entire year focusing on inequality and its implications in America, and its impacts on how long people live, the health care they can get, the housing they have, the education they can have are just enormous. And they also affect whether or not you're likely to be in the military and whether the military's financial inducements will mean more to you than someone else. So I think that's, now the question is whether we should solve it in the military before we solve it everywhere else. I just got some statistics. There were in 2016 there were more than 17,000 people murdered in the United States. 765 of them were murdered in just Chicago. 106 of them were murdered here just in Columbus. And in that same year, fewer than 100 American service people were killed in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. And now over the last 10 years, at about 15 to 17,000 murders a year, we heard this morning Dr. Shen saying there were 7,000 dead and maybe 50,000 wounded. We're looking in the neighborhood of over a decade, 150,000 dead, mostly in American cities, from murder. And I would imagine the disproportionate number of them are coming from lower means, lower education, lower opportunities in life. I'm not saying that there's an equivalency. I'm just saying there are a lot of problems in America. And there's a lot of ways to lose your life. For many people, maybe joining the military is actually a safer environment than they've been living in. Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons they're going there. It's not because they think they're going to get into a more dangerous situation. They're getting into a less dangerous situation. So I'm very sympathetic. I don't want to postpone working on the problem of how we're going to defend our country until we've perfected everything about it internally. I think that's unrealistic. But I do think there's good reason to not exaggerate beyond all reason external threats and take our eye off, I hate to sound like our president, but America first. There are a lot of things here in the United States that we need to focus on and fix if we're going to ask, let's say, to have a conscripted system again or large national service. So I guess I kind of agree with you, but I don't know how to solve it.
I just want to add one thing to that. I agree with everything that Rick just said. However, I also would point out that that even though there is inequality across all kinds of dimensions of American society, the military does have some history of actually being an institution that's helped to combat those over time. So if you think about things like desegregation, that the military has played some role in being a kind of a vanguard of pushing more equality. Not to where did Professor Shen go? But anyway, not to downplay those costs, but so the military could be an institution that would be helping to start fixing these problems as part of a broader solution instead of waiting till afterwards would be a possibility. Let's see, you were waiting over there.
Colonel Young, you mentioned that you were a personnel reform advocate.
I am.
And you also mentioned the reforms pushed by Secretary of Defense Ash Carter. I was wondering what are some of the more radical personnel reforms that you would propose to help solve the problem of retention?
Well, let me just tell you that what I agreed with Secretary of Defense Ash Carter to answer your question. First of all, I don't think, unlike the service chiefs in Congress, that his recommendations were extreme or too liberal. Okay, here's some of the things he advocated. He basically wanted to end the up or out career progressions, but within the services. Because think about it, you join the military as a young person. If you commit, that's your career path, right? You can't join at a later date. We raise our own up through there. There's no lateral entry. But he wanted to allow lateral entry. And he wanted to allow sabbaticals. He wanted to allow, the gates that an officer has to jump through today to be competitive promotion is unrealistic. They have to hit all those assignments right on the money, and they don't have time to go off to, Princeton and spend 2 years solving a problem, or they don't have time to take a sabbatical for family reasons or for other reasons. Some of the things that our most successful multinational corporations have adopted over the years. He wanted to have on-ramps and off-ramps for talent, especially technology talent, to come in and out of the military between DOD and the technology sector. He wanted to create an entrepreneurs in residence program so that if we had young airmen like some of the ones I serve with who have volunteered to be in our innovation lab, that they could devote a good proportion of their service time to thinking outside the box and bring an entrepreneurial spirit to the military. He wanted to establish an office of people analytics and to resume exit surveys. Do you know that when our soldiers and airmen leave, there's not a human relations exit survey? Why are you leaving us? We don't know. He wanted to launch LinkedIn-style pilot programs, like you all I know LinkedIn, and that would allow our service members to really get a jump on their next assignment, for example. He wanted a much greater focus on lifestyle issues because he recognized that our service members have an equal commitment to the service and their families. I grew up in an army that said mission first, families always. I didn't believe that. And he wanted to extend child care hours, and he wanted to offer things like paternity leave in addition to maternity leave. And like I said, he was none of this got any traction. I'm sorry, sir? It does. I hope that answered your question. So.
Okay, we're in the interest of I'm glad to see hands up and people wanting to contribute to the conversation, and that's terrific. But in the interest of staying on time, I want to just offer our panelists here any chance for any brief last things you'd want to say.
Thanks for doing this. Sincere.
I would like to take my 90 seconds and just ask any student out there if they have an answer to the 2 questions I posed you, in addition to the young lady who stepped up and did that. Anyone volunteer? What would get you to enlist or take a commission in the Army or the Air Force today? Yes?
Control of my future.
Control of your future? That's what I hear. I hear that every day from our airmen.
Got somebody over there.
You're one of our airmen? Thank you.
Got another one over there, I guess.
A more direct path after service into a government job, whether it be federal or state government.
Interesting comment. We are attracting, on the DoD side, on the civilian side, what's interesting is we're attracting people like you into the service, but we're not keeping them. They're leaving in masses after just a couple years.
For me, I think like the biggest threat would be, I'm scared of how it would come out after I serve, like far as what effects would the service actually have on me. So if I was to have like a guaranteed thing that I would be okay after I serve, which I know isn't plausible.
There's too many people coming back with moral injuries. We haven't talked about moral injuries, but it is, I believe it's an epidemic in our returning veterans. It's a risk you take when you join, because we're always going to be at war, right? If you enlist, you're going to go to war. In fact, the Secretary of Defense just said that if you're not deployable, get the hell out of our services. Yes, ma'am.
I want a contract and a non-compete clause.
And a non-disclosure agreement?
Yeah.
And 4 lawyers.
Rick, you have any final thoughts?
Do
Or
you-
one more?
the-
Or you want?
Personally, I would, with the VA situation, would want to know that I'm taken care of by the government for sure, 100% if I were to enlist. And also, I feel that the service is not really respected when it comes to seeking jobs after the military as much as it should be. More of a respect level from companies. That's not anything on the military, but that's society in general.
Well, I think, I don't want to hold us up from lunch long. So, it seems to me, listening this morning, there's 2 pressures there are many pressures on the AVF, but we heard from Professor Bailey this morning that the all-volunteer force, or conscription, was a way to get everybody paying attention so that they would put more pressure on our foreign policy and pay more attention to it. Of course, what's happening is people aren't paying much attention to that foreign policy, and they're not joining the AVF. Of course, they have the freedom not to, and in some ways they're voting with their feet not to support these wars that we've got ourselves into. But it's a much more messy way that leaves a terrible burden on the people who do choose to pursue those wars. We're going to break a little here for lunch, but we're going to have a talk that's got to, I think, concentrate not just a little on American foreign policy at the lunchtime, but that'll be in maybe 25 or 30 minutes. Because obviously there's this need for force. It's partly a function of what we do around the world. And then I just want to thank all of you, students and not, for coming and listening. And now, after the lunch talk, we'll feed you lunch. We'll give you, I hope, a very interesting lunch keynote. And then you have to go to work, because you need to think through what we've said and heard, and hopefully offer ideas at the macro level or at the mid-level or all the way down to programmatic ideas you want to carry forward into the national conversation over the next several months or years. And that's something we're really looking forward to you helping with. So that's what
And thank you to all the panelists. And one last logistical note is, if I could ask people to make 2 lines as you go past the sandwich table, that will allow people to get their lunches faster and allow us to get back in here more quickly for what promises to be a very interesting keynote address. So join me in thanking the panelists.